Hello, and welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable, the only podcast that dares to be both on topic and on location, whether virtual or physical. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and I'm a part of the Gestalt IT community, and for each episode, we reach out to some of the luminaries in the IT industry who have unique perspectives, and we debate a premise, a topic, if you will, that is important to people out there. So, without further ado, I'd like to take a moment and have our guests today introduce themselves, starting with Chris.
Hey there, my name's Chris Cummings. You can find me on Twitter at CrankyNetman. I've been in the service provider realm for on and off over the past decade. So yeah, that's me.
All right, and Nick?
I'm Nick Buraglio. My Twitter handle is @forwardingplane, and I've been in the service provider industry in one form or another since the late 90s.
All right, and Vince?
My name is Schuele. You can find me on Twitter at Schuele22, and I've been a consulting architect for service providers for the past couple of years.
All right, thank you very much for joining us today. Let's jump into the premise for today's episode. Now, as you've probably guessed from the folks that we have on the podcast here, we're going to be talking a little bit about service providers. You know, that cloud in your network diagram where all of the packets go and then magically find their way where they're supposed to be. But it's a network, right? And networking is networking. And if you know how to configure a switch in an enterprise, then you obviously know how to configure a frame relay switch, right? Because a switch is a switch. And you're probably already growling at the computer because you know that service provider networks are a little bit different than what we would consider to be a traditional enterprise network. But I'm not a service provider networking person. Thankfully, these three folks are. So I wanted to introduce the premise for today's episode that service provider networks are not your enterprise network. And I wanted to give our guests a chance to kind of talk about some of the challenges that they see in service provider networking that are radically different than the ones that you would see inside of an enterprise. So I'm going to open the floor up to you gentlemen. Do you believe that a service provider network is not an enterprise network?
Yes. I mean,
why?
At some level, they have similarities, but they're very different to operate. They're very different to build, and they're very different to, just deal with in almost every way. And I'll answer your question of why by starting at the very bottom. A huge portion of a service provider network exists outside. It's not inside your building. So there's an elemental piece of a service provider network that is just different than if I run, say, an enterprise network inside a single building. I may have to deal with structured cabling, but I don't have to worry about squirrels chewing through my fiber or someone hitting a pole, and knocking out, connectivity. And my redundancy model or my fault tolerant model is going to be very different.
I wanted to piggyback on what Nick had to say there. I couldn't agree more that the biggest difference is the physical layer. Once you start having to deal with, the fiber was cut and that fiber carried all these different backhauls. Now I have huge portions of my network down that I'm trying to route around, or there was a hurricane and now I don't have good enough quality to pass the link for RF or SATCOM. You have a whole different set of problems that you have to worry about there on the physical layer. And when you're in an enterprise data center, you just kind of expect that you can run as many cables and fiber and it's going to work and you're not going to have to think about it. You have perfectly symmetrical paths and that's the end of it.
Yeah, I'd have to say that I kind of straddle the fence on this one. I do agree that service provider networking is fundamentally it does have some differences. Obviously the physical layer, like we talked about, but there are a lot of similarities. On the one hand, you're using a lot of the same protocols, you're using a lot of the same physical mediums and to some degree, and there's a lot of crossover. So I don't know if I can say that I exactly agree or exactly disagree with the premise. But I would say there isn't anything to be afraid of in service provider networking if you're in the enterprise. I think it's something that's within reach of folks, and I think there's definitely enterprises that do run enterprises that run service provider style networks inside themselves. And you see that a lot in education, perhaps, where you have a campus that's running like MPLS on their campus that diverges a lot from maybe a typical, private business campus that might be just doing routing or VLANs or things like that. And I think a lot of that ties back to how you have to scale things. And so I think for me, what differentiates service provider networking a lot from enterprise networking is the scale of things, the number of devices you have to support, the distance between things. It's like everybody took your network diagram and dragged it by the corners to make it bigger. It's kind of what it feels like to me.
So I actually want to riff on that point for just a moment, because I think that there are a lot of times, even inside of the community of networking equipment and infrastructure vendors, that there is a disconnect in what an enterprise looks like. Because when I think of an enterprise, I think of an organization that is somewhere between, 500 and 2,000 users. That is, maybe a couple of sites. It's a headquarters and a couple of branches or something like that. And I did a lot of work in my formative career in school districts. And some of the biggest school districts I worked in were 20-something sites. But when an enterprise networking vendor talks to me about what an enterprise is, I always hear Boeing or Facebook or super large enterprises, either companies with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users, or hyperscalers, people who are doing things with their network that don't look like what I would consider to be a traditional enterprise, but they're still going to classify them as enterprise, because to these vendors, service providers provide transport between enterprise customers. So does that change the conversation when we cut out the lower tier, which quite honestly nobody seems to care about anyway, and probably won't be running BGP, EVPN, MPLS in their networks anytime soon, and restrict it to those higher tier companies, kind of like you said, Chris, that are incorporating service provider type protocols and technologies and policies into their networks, because quite honestly, they look like a service provider to their customers.
I think there's a really important distinction to make here. You used the word hyperscalers, and we've all said it. Most of us have said it, and we've all thought it. Almost no one is Facebook, Boeing, Google. How many of those are there, right? There's maybe 50 or 100 hyperscalers, if I'm being, really liberal with the definition. And they may employ a lot of people, but in the overall number of actual organizations, I think that they are disproportionately hyped. As this is, Amazon is doing this. So maybe, mom and pop that has 4 retail locations should do this too. Makes no sense whatsoever, right? Amazon has, or whoever, right? It doesn't really matter. The hyperscaler has the resources to employ the people that are going to understand those types of things and are going to operate at that scale. Whereas, mom and pop shop that might exist in one state or in one, geographic area, or maybe a couple of states, if they're really big, they're going to contract that stuff out. They're going to go to a traditional service provider and say, I need connectivity from here to here. They might, if they're really advanced, they might do some SD-WAN stuff, right? But for the most part, I think you've got the tier that you've mentioned, the hyperscalers, right? I'm going to throw those out. Like, they don't apply because they can run their own network. Google literally runs their own fiber backbone that is global. So does Facebook. They have undersea cables. There's some service providers that don't even have that. They're just a completely different scope. Whereas, you just don't have that kind of thing within that middle tier, which is by the numbers, the largest demographic that we're talking about here.
Nick, on that, I wanted to go back to that middle tier as well, because even some of those enterprises that I get a chance to work on that are pretty large, but they're nowhere near the size of the hyperscale. So they might have the needs for high availability on their servers. They might have the need for BGP in the data center to, take advantage of routing and not running span and tray. We all want to get rid of that in our data center. I think we can agree there, right? So, you start to see things. But I think where we went wrong is all that started to focus on using things that got purpose built or adapted an old enterprise technology, looking at Trill or Fabric Path or anything along those lines, versus going all the way and taking advantage of all the lessons that were learned in service provider as to how to adapt the tech to make sure that you have the availability that you're looking for.
Now, I will say that is actually part of the reason why I kind of wonder about this crossover between service providers and enterprise, is because a lot of the technologies that we see that have filtered down into the enterprise that are must use, whether it's Trill, Fabric Path, BGP, EVPN, VXLAN, whatever, started out at that high tier. They started out as a solution to a point problem. And maybe the question that I have for you guys around those lines is the problem not that we're wanting to go all the way and force people to look at a solution to a problem as a process, as a policy, as an architecture issue, but hey, here's this button that you can hit that fixes this big issue for now. And I love the fact that you brought up Trill, Vince, because that was actually one of the things you wrote an excellent post recently about migrating from Trill to EVPN. And I can remember how Fabric Path was going to solve all of my problems. And then it didn't, because people adopted it for a little bit. And then we kicked the can down the road a little further until a better solution came along, ironically enough, out of the service provider space. So are we creating our own monster here by selecting these technologies and pushing them down into the enterprise and saying, just configure this and it'll work, without fixing the root cause of the problem?
Tom, along that point, right? Like a lot of the gear that went into the enterprise, when you started to buy that, it didn't have MPLS labeled depth, right? So there was no option for that. So that's where you kind of got your hand forced on other data plane encapsulations. You didn't have a choice but to go with VXLAN because it was supported, and you didn't want to go and buy a couple $100,000 worth of new gear to upgrade everything to get the capability. So that starts to force that rabbit hole that I think you just talked about.
I think there's another really important distinction that we really never talk about. We talk about the product, right? Everybody's got their network or their business, and that business is focused around a product, right? For an enterprise, their product can be anything. I'm selling a widget, I'm building bicycles, I'm making backdrops for people that do Zoom calls. That's their product, right? What's the product of a service provider? The network is the product, right? So the scope and scale and the way the mindset works for something like that is going to be different, because the network is the actual product that they're selling. So therefore, it is the complete and total focus of what they're doing. All the ancillary pieces that exist for that to function and to be a product that they can sell only exist so that they can do that. Whereas the network exists for, random enterprise, so that they can sell whatever it is that they've got. It's a tool. The network is a tool for them, whereas a network is a product for the service provider. And I think that's really important when we start to think about how these things break down. I do think that there's more bleed over than there's ever been between the two, right? You've got all these technologies that are sort of migrating. Frankly, they go both directions, right? There's things that go, from one to the other. But if you think about what those products are, I think that is a key distinguishing factor in how you make your procurements, right? Whereas an enterprise is going to say, I need connectivity. I don't really care where it comes from. It needs to be reliable, cheap, fast, reliable, pick two. Whereas if you've got a service provider, you're like, I need to be able to provide connectivity. So I need fiber in the ground. Am I going to put the fiber in the ground myself, or am I going to contract dark fiber from somebody else and then light that fiber with my own optical equipment? Not that many enterprises are lighting their own optical networks. They do exist, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's being built that does connectivity between buildings and metro areas and even long haul stuff that is significantly more affordable and approachable than it used to be. But by and large, I think that is one particular technology that is mostly focused in the service provider space. And that's why, right? Because they're very different products.
Nick, I'm glad you brought up the point that is my favorite thing on earth to like harp on, which is that the network is the product in a service provider, whereas a lot of times the enterprise is just an ends to a means, or a means to an end, rather. And for me, having been on both sides of the coin, being in the enterprise where I just had a cloud that I put bits into and they came out the other side most of the time, and then I moved from service provider over to enterprise and then back over to service provider. I think one of the reasons I went back to service provider is because, I wanted to work somewhere where, that's kind of your goal. And I think it does allow you to have different levels of freedom in the service provider space than you would in the enterprise space. Because, now there's good enterprises out there, of course, that understand that a solid network is critical to accomplishing their business goals, but not all do. And so I think that a lot of folks in the enterprise space, unfortunately, are always fighting against management, not wanting to spend money on upgrades or not wanting to put in this new technology that would solve, these problems, because at the end of the day, when the CFO looks at the budget, goes, okay, we've got janitorial supplies and cleaning staff. Okay, we've got IT. Okay. And then it's like, oh, and here's the people who make our widgets. We love them. Give them all the resources. And I'm not saying it's impossible to have good management structure in an enterprise. There's plenty that do. I've worked for some that do, but it can be a bit easier to find that in the service provider side, where you find that sweet spot of, oh, everybody really understands networking, and you don't have to deal as much with the server guys coming over and be like, oh, we think it's the network. What have you done to test this? Well, I tried to load a web page, that kind of stuff. It's kind of nice to be a little bit removed from that. So there's definitely a difference there.
And I would honestly say that is a visibility issue, that most enterprises look at the network as a cost center, just like they do all of IT or, anything other than really accounting and sales. But service providers do look at it as a profit center. And I think that maybe that was kind of the impetus behind a lot of the movement that we saw years ago of changing the way that IT responds to these requests to effectively act like a service provider, was to show that they were providing value, which is what you see a lot of times with things like chargebacks and other structures that are created to make it show that there is a real kind of monetary value that they provide to ensure that everybody's able to do things. But does that actually go far enough to solve the problem? Because essentially all you're doing is you're just kind of rearranging the piles on the table to say, oh, well, we're really doing this for your own good, and you should be happy that we're doing it and not charging you what these people over here would. Because the other flip side of that coin is that in a lot of places, companies will just outsource their entire IT department to a service provider to do those kinds of things, which kind of gets into some different things to have to worry about. But is it that we focus so much on trying to convince people that enterprise IT isn't a cost center, that we've lost track of the fact that, kind of as Nick said, the ultimate goal is to provide network connectivity. Doesn't matter if it's between the users in your system or the systems in your provider network.
I know that we've lost sight of that. I think, like many times, in the last 15 minutes, we've sort of said it's blurring a little bit. And part of that blurring is what you said, right? We're trying to justify that this is not cost center, like this actually aids in generation of profit or whatever. And so by the nature of that, it sort of puts it in that category, right? But I don't think that's a bad thing, really. I mean, I think that that's just something that has evolved into what it is today. I don't know. What do you think? What do you guys think?
I think there's actually a few different lines here as well, because some people, when they are selling something, they're selling a product that they host themselves, right? And that makes their business becomes very relevant. I see those companies adopting the change that we're talking about and having that bleed over, and that's all levels of enterprise IT that I've been working with. But as the companies that don't host a product that they sell, they're just using their IT as a website or to keep track of simple stuff. Maybe it's not so important that they're up 5 nines or whatever mechanism of measuring uptime you want to use, that they're down for a couple hours, whatever, I'll go out and pick up the phone and call somebody and go visit some of my customers.
I remember who it was that said it, but I think it was some famous CEO or financial type said something that was like, "Don't tell me you want to spend $1 million to protect 1 million, or like, don't tell me you want to spend $1 million to protect $1 of value." And I think that when it comes to network uptime, like you're saying there, Vince, yeah, sometimes it doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be up all the time. Hang me up for saying that, but downtime's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right, but when you look at that from the service provider perspective, that's a really different answer, right? No one cares when the network is working because it's a utility at this point. My family doesn't care that our internet connection at home is up. They just expect it to be up. But when it's down, if I'm not home, I'm getting phone calls and text messages. And, if I'm home, they're coming to find me in the house, right? Because it's like the electricity being off, except for I can actually fix it usually. So it's a really different point of view, because the network is often, from a service provider point of view, or from a service provider customer's point of view, is a utility that they're paying for to be available all the time, even if they're not buying an SLA or whatever. It doesn't matter. The expectation is that this just works. Like when I turn the faucet on, water comes out. When I turn the light on, it comes up. When I switch the switch, the light comes on. When I open my browser up, I expect to be able to get to whatever I'm trying to get to. It's a utility at this point in people's minds. How it's categorized outside of that is irrelevant. How people perceive it is that it's always available. So downtime from a service provider point of view is a really, really different thing.
I think that's something that it changes the network design sometimes, depending on the scale or scope of the enterprise. But yeah, that's why a lot of service provider tech, look at the kind of router that you're putting in a backbone, location on a network in a big service provider, right? A lot of times it's going to have, 4 or 8 power supplies. It's going to have at least 2 routing engines, maybe 3. It's going to have a bunch of line cards, and that's just for one router. Maybe you'll have 2 of those super redundant boxes, and I think that's not something that you do as much anymore. The 60, except for the people that are still running 6509s in their closets.
I think there's also, I'm going to go on the topic I was at a little bit further. Even within those enterprises that meet that line, you start to see them breaking up their IT into different functions. Of they have a staff that does corporate IT, and that just handles, the office jobs, and those guys have a very different network design than the side that handles their content or the product that they're selling. And that product side is where you see all the service provider tech going in. On the corporate side, you still see a distribution switch with HSRP and as many things that you can stack together in the closet to connect a couple hundred guys there.
As I say, that is a nice dovetail from both Chris and Vince into the differences in the hardware. And you do see, I think you'll see in service providers, you'll see this class of gear and this class of gear, where this class of gear is your service provider, your carrier grade stuff, and then you're going to have like some switches and things like that. And the enterprise, it's going to be flipped, right? You probably have 1 or 2 routers that may need buffer and TCAM space, but you're going to need a lot of switch ports. So there's almost a mirror image of each other in the equipment in most cases between what I would consider to be a typical run-of-the-mill enterprise, middle-sized enterprise, and a service provider.
So let me flip this question on its head a little bit, because as we kind of have determined, the lines are blurring between what a service provider network looks like and what an enterprise network looks like. And there are things that are flowing back and forth between them to kind of, solve problems or change the way that we look at IT. but should those lines be blurred? Is it a good idea to carry a lot of the design practices and the infrastructure down from a service provider into the enterprise, or vice versa? Because as we blur those lines, it challenges the way that we look at these things and creates additional complexity in places that maybe it doesn't need to be created. So should we maybe draw a bright line between the two and say, if you're doing this, you're service provider, and this is what you have to work with, and if you're doing this, you're an enterprise, and this is what you get to work with, and ne'er the twain shall meet?
My opinion is make them kiss. They belong together, very much so. I think that you benefit a lot from having basically that cross-pollination between the two veins of networking, at least the two veins that we're talking about. You know, if you are at a service provider, that enterprise knowledge that you might bring if you came from enterprise to a service provider, that can be really valuable because you'll have the insight into what the customers actually care about. Whereas you might actually learn that, hey, the customers don't care about anything except for the bits just get there. You know, you might also be able to take that because a lot of service providers still have to have enterprise style networks too, and need to have data centers to run your DHCP services, all of your, broadband authentication stuff. Like, I mean, there is just a ton of services that you need to run as a service provider, your DNS, resolvers and all that stuff. And if I'm being honest, a lot of service providers have that as kind of the shoemaker's child. I'm mixing my metaphors a lot today, but basically, it's always oft forgotten about. You just have these, data centers that are just a shame pit nobody wants to deal with. And so, I think from the enterprise to the service provider, there's a lot of value in that way. And then from the service provider to the enterprise too, because there are a lot of folks in enterprise networking that don't understand, routing at the level you might need to know, and don't understand. I mean, I've met tons of folks who just don't know that there was a world before NAT. Don't know that there's a world where you could have redundancy by using routing and BGP and multiple transit providers and advertising your address space. And so there's just lots of cross-pollination. And I say, let them mix.
Okay, I'm gonna agree on this as well. I think they need a mix, but I think the question, it comes down to the scale and what you're trying to do, right? And I think why the service provider data centers get ignored is they might have one pizza box, and I'm not going to run an EVPN fabric for one server. I'm going to put an SVI somewhere, and I'm probably going to forget about it until, it doesn't work anymore. And then I'm going to have to go and deal with that. Whereas in a enterprise or a content delivery or hosting, they're going to have this really massive data center with thousands of servers. You're going to have big firewalls at the edge to do filtering. You're going to have load balancers. And when you're just slinging packets back and forth, there's not a lot of that on the other side.
I don't have quite as poetic of a interpretation. To me, everything is just a tool in the toolbox. And I'm going to use whatever tool it is that I need to build whatever I need to build. That might be, a layer 2 switch, and that's it. It might be, a half of a cabinet that has 400 gig ports in every blade, but there's only 8 ports. They're just tools in the toolbox. I think you pick the ones that you need for the job that you have to do. So if I'm an enterprise and I need to have, 1,000 desktops online, I'm not, I'm not going to buy a giant carrier router or, as many of those as I'm going to need. I'm going to buy as many, layer 2 switches as I can get away with to plumb layer 2 through. And conversely, I'm not going to try to push, a full long fat network through a data center switch. Just because it has 100 gig port on it doesn't mean it can move 100 gig in the WAN, right? Probably has no buffer whatsoever, which is really important in a service provider network. That is not really so important in an enterprise network in most cases. So if you just think about the toolboxes, the tools as tools in a toolbox, you just pick the one that you need. Don't use a screwdriver when you need a hammer, and vice versa. And I think that's really the best advice that I could give.
And I think we do a really bad disservice as networkers by not exploring those tools, because I can't count how many times somebody's told me as I'm learning a new technology, oh yeah, you don't need to know that because it's enterprise, or oh, you don't need to know that because it's service provider. And it's like, well, my toolbox is getting a lot smaller now and I don't know the options. So I feel pigeonholed into what I know, because if everything is dependent on that, I'm going to go with what I know, even if it's subpar versus something I'm extremely uncomfortable with when it comes down to the decision time.
Yeah, I think that we're all kind of at the point where we agree that while they're two separate networks, there's a lot of things that each can learn from the other. And more importantly, it's not just a technology conversation. It's not a switch or a 400 gig optic or a router the size of a refrigerator. Instead, it's the other things. It's the planning. It is the design. It is the way that you look at the way you provide services to people that helps kind of more clearly blur that line, if that's a thing, when it comes to, are you a service provider? Are you an enterprise? Or should there even be a distinction? And kind of to Nick's point, they're all tools at the end of the day, whether it's a wireless network or a spreadsheet or a phone on the CEO's desk that he uses to make phone calls to get sales. Ultimately, they're all things that are used to provide value to the business, to allow you to do the job of the business, because unless you are a service provider, your business is probably not providing IT. But even if you are a service provider and your business is providing connectivity or IT services or whatever it is, you still have to have those same services to support the things that you do. So ultimately, I think the premise here is valid, but the question will be, for how much longer? I want to thank everybody for joining us on this episode of the On-Premise IT Roundtable today. Remember that you can always find the latest episode of our podcast by going to gestaltit.com/podcast. You can also subscribe in your favorite podcast application of choice, or check us out on our YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/gestaltitvideo. And we will also invite you to check out more great discussions about some of the service provider technologies by heading over to our other sister site, techfieldday.com, and clicking on the link for Networking Field Day Service Provider. December 8th and 9th, we will be talking about all these challenges and more with companies that are making the service provider equipment, and maybe we can get you a more definitively blurred answer by then. So for myself, Tom Hollingsworth, for our great guests and our wonderful members of the Gestalt IT community, thank you very much for tuning in. We hope to see you soon, and have a good day.